In a private collection in Norway, resting behind climate-controlled glass, sits a black stone stele that should not exist. Not in the sense that it is fraudulent. Its authenticity has been verified by multiple institutions, but in the sense that what it depicts challenges our comfortable understanding of how knowledge moves through time. MS 2006-3, as it is catalogued in the Cheyenne collection, measures 47 centimetres tall. Black limestone carved during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II between 604 and 562 BCE. The stone is divided into 3 sections. At the top, the king himself, standing in profile, staff in hand. In the middle section, an architectural rendering of a massive stepped tower, 7 distinct levels rising toward a temple platform. At the bottom, something more curious, a precise floor plan, geometric and measured, showing the tower's foundation as a perfect square. This is not an artist's imagination. This is a construction document rendered in stone. The tower depicted is Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. The Ziggurat of Babylon that modern scholarship cautiously, almost reluctantly, identifies as the probable historical referent for the Tower of Babel. What makes MS 2006-3 unsettling is not simply that it shows this tower. It is that the measurements inscribed on the stele align with archaeological evidence excavated a century ago by German archaeologist Robert Koldewey. Between 1899 and 1917, Koldewey's team uncovered the foundation of Etemenanki in the ruins of Babylon. The base, when measured, proved to be 91 meters by 91 meters, precisely as the ancient text described. The stone tells us Nebuchadnezzar was not inventing this tower, he was restoring it. Which raises a question that would occupy us for many quiet hours. Restoring it from what? From how far back does the memory of this structure reach? And why, across multiple ancient civilizations separated by more than 1,000 years, does the same story recur of a tower built to reach the heavens and of human language fractured to stop its completion? If you are listening to this in the dark hours before sleep, or in the liminal space of early morning, take a moment to think about where you are. Comment below what city, what country, what corner of the world holds you as these words reach you. Because what we are about to explore together concerns a moment when all the world, according to texts older than the Bible, spoke with one mouth and one speech, and then did not. The Hebrew Bible presents the Tower of Babel story in Genesis chapter 11. It is brief, almost abrupt. Humanity, speaking one language, decides to build a city and a tower reaching to heaven. God observes this and remarks that if people can do this while unified in speech, nothing they plan will be impossible for them. So God confuses their language, scatters them across the earth, and the tower remains unfinished. Traditional interpretation frames this as a story about human pride. Mankind's hubris, attempting to storm heaven, met with divine correction. The confusion of tongues becomes punishment, a humbling and necessary fragmentation to keep humanity in its proper place. But what if that interpretation, while centuries old, is not what the older texts suggest? Because the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis did not emerge from nowhere. The Hebrew scribes who composed it lived in a world saturated with Mesopotamian literature. During the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, Jewish scholars encountered the vast libraries of cuneiform tablets, the deep textual traditions of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. They would have known the stories. They would have read or heard read the ancient epics. And among those epics is a Sumerian composition that predates Genesis by more than 1,000 years. It is called Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, preserved in multiple clay tablet copies dating to the Neo-Sumerian period around 2100 BCE, though the events it describes are set even earlier, in the misty time after the flood when kingship was restored to the earth. In this text there is a passage that speaks of a time when all the lands spoke to Enlil in one language. A passage that describes the god Enki, Lord of Wisdom, changing the speech in the mouths of mankind. a passage that presents the confusion of tongues not as punishment for attempting heaven, but as strategic intervention against a king who sought linguistic unity specifically to accomplish a monumental construction project. What if the Tower of Babel story is not about pride? What if it is about capability? What if the gods did not scatter human language because we aimed too high, but because unified language made us too organized, too capable, too dangerous in what we could achieve when every worker understood every instruction, when every architect could communicate precisely with every engineer, when every plan could be executed without the friction of translation? This is what the Sumerian texts suggest. And if that is true, then the confusion of tongues was not punishment. It was strategy. A deliberate fragmentation to limit not human arrogance, but human potential. We will spend the hours ahead examining this possibility, not to prove it, but to explore it. To lay out the evidence, the tablets, the translations, the archaeological ruins, the strange patterns that repeat across civilizations. We will present what the mainstream scholars say, and we will look carefully at what their interpretations struggle to explain. We will read the Sumerian words in translation and ask what those ancient scribes thought they were recording. And by the end, you will have the evidence before you. You will decide what it means. But first, we must go back. Back before Babylon. Back before the tower. Back to the beginning, when kingship descended from heaven and the world was young. Before Babylon. The cities that kingship descended. To understand the Tower of Babel, we must first understand what the Sumerians believed about knowledge itself. The Sumerians did not think of civilization as something humanity invented. They described it as something humanity received. In their worldview, the arts of city building, kingship, law, agriculture, writing, and temple construction were not gradual discoveries emerging from trial and error. They were divine decrees, cosmic principles, gifts from the gods that had to be transferred, taught, and maintained. This distinction is not semantic, it is foundational to how Sumerian texts frame the origin of human achievement. When a king builds a temple, he is not innovating, he is restoring. When a scribe masters Cuneiform, he is not creating a system, he is preserving one that was handed down. Sumerian culture presents itself as inheritors of knowledge, not inventors of it. And the most striking evidence of this perspective comes from an object that currently resides in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. It is called the Weld-Blundell Prism. The catalogue number is AN 1923 444. Herbert Weld-Blundell, a British archaeologist, discovered it in 1922 during excavations at Larsa in southern Iraq. The prism is a clay vertical column about 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all four sides with neat columns of cuneiform text. It dates to approximately 1800 BCE, though the tradition it records is far older. The Weld-Blundell prism contains what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a chronological account of kingship in Mesopotamia from the moment it descended from heaven down through historical dynasties. The document begins with these words: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not after the first king arose. Not after people chose a leader. After kingship descended from heaven. The text presents rulership as a cosmic principle that existed above and then was lowered to earth, to the city of Eridu, where it was held by the first king, Alulim. What makes the king list profoundly strange is what it says about the earliest rulers. It divides history into two periods, before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian section lists 8 kings who ruled 5 cities, and the lengths of their reigns are not human-scaled. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar, the second king, ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibera ruled for 40,200 years. The shortest reign listed is 18,600 years. Modern scholarship treats these numbers as symbolic, or as the result of some numerical system we do not fully understand, or perhaps as a scribal confusion between different calendar reckonings. That is a reasonable position. But the Sumerians themselves do not present these numbers as symbolic, they present them as records. The text does not say Alulim reigned for a symbolically long time. It says he reigned 28 to 800 years, with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for later, historically verifiable kings. The list continues through the antediluvian period until it reaches the flood. Then, abruptly, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. After the flood, the reigns become shorter. Still exaggerated by our standards, early post-flood kings reigned for hundreds of years, but no longer tens of thousands. And gradually, as the list progresses through dynasties, the reign lengths decrease until they reach plausible human lifespans by the time we get to historically attested kings in the 3rd millennium BCE. What is this text describing? The mainstream interpretation suggests the king list is a political document, compiled to legitimize the concept of unified kingship over all Sumer by presenting it as a single, divinely ordained office that passed from city to city. The exaggerated reign lengths serve to create a mythic past, lending ancient authority to contemporary dynasties. The flood serves as a narrative break, separating the mythic age from the increasingly historical age. This interpretation is careful and cautious, but it does not engage with what the text says it is doing. The king list does not present itself as mythology, it presents itself as record keeping. The same document that gives us 28,800-year reigns also gives us historically accurate information about 3rd millennium dynasties. Archaeologists have confirmed many of the later kings on the list. We have their inscriptions, we have their building projects. The king list is not pure invention, so what is it recording when it describes the antediluvian kings? Here is a possibility the text itself suggests. What if the extraordinary reign lengths are not meant to be taken literally as individual lifespans, but as dynastic periods? What if Alulim reigned 28,800 years means the Alulim dynasty maintained kingship in Eridu for 28,800 years? This would imply that the antediluvian period was vastly longer than the few thousand years we typically imagine, and that kingship was maintained by institutions or lineages, not individuals. But there is another detail in the text that complicates even this reading. The king list does not just give us names and numbers, it tells us where kingship was: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. These are not mythical cities, these are real places. We have excavated them. Eridu, in particular, has been extensively studied. The archaeological site shows evidence of continuous occupation from the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE, through the early dynastic period. If Eridu was the first city where kingship descended, and if the king list records a memory of a time when knowledge, including writing, law, temple architecture, and administration, was transmitted from the gods, then we are being told that civilization began at a specific place and spread from there. Not that each settlement independently developed agriculture and pottery and government, that it began in one location and was carried to others. This matches the Sumerian concept of the me. The me were not abstract ideas. They were almost physical things, decrees or laws or functions that could be stolen, gifted, or transferred. In another Sumerian myth, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and gets Enki drunk, then makes off with over 100 me, bringing them to her city of Uruk. The me include kingship, priesthood, writing, metalworking, music, law, and many other civilizational arts. The story presents these as transferable objects of knowledge. If this is how the Sumerians understood their own origins, as receivers and preservers of knowledge that predated them, then what happened at the flood? The Weld-Blundell prism tells us the flood swept over, and afterward kingship had to descend from heaven again. The implication is that the flood destroyed not just people, but the continuity of kingship, the chain of transmitted knowledge. Whatever had been carefully maintained for tens of thousands of years was broken, and had to be restored, but not fully restored. Because after the flood, the reigns grow shorter, the cities more numerous, the dynasties less stable, Something was lost. Now, other copies of the Sumerian king list exist. Not all of them are identical. One variant, preserved at the University of Pennsylvania Museum as CBS 53365, includes slightly different details. Another fragmentary version was found at Nippur. The tradition was recopied across centuries, and small variations crept in. But the overall structure remains consistent antediluvian kings with extraordinary reigns in 5 cities, the flood, post-diluvian kings with shortening reigns, and, eventually, the dynasties we can verify archaeologically. Why does this matter for the Tower of Babel? Because the Tower of Babel story in Genesis also divides history at the flood. Genesis 1:9 covers creation and the flood. Genesis 10 gives the table of nations, the genealogy of Noah's descendants spreading across the earth. And then Genesis 11 opens with these words, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words." When? After the flood. After humanity had been reduced to Noah's family and their descendants began repopulating the earth. The Tower of Babel episode occurs in the context of post-flood restoration, the same context the Sumerian king list describes. If we read Genesis 11 alongside the king list, a pattern emerges. After the flood, humanity attempts to rebuild civilization. In the Sumerian account, kingship descends from heaven again and settles in Kish. Cities are refounded, temples are constructed. In the Genesis account, humanity settles in the plain of Shinar, the biblical name for Sumer, and begins to build. But something goes wrong. Or rather, something is interrupted. In Genesis, the interruption is linguistic. God confuses their language and the construction stops. In the Sumerian king list, the interruption is more subtle. After the flood, kingship becomes unstable. It moves from Kish to Uruk to Ur to Awan, shifting between cities in relatively short periods. The unified antediluvian system, where one dynasty could maintain power for tens of thousands of years, collapses into a fragmented system of competing city-states. What if these are two ways of describing the same historical fracture? What if the confusion of languages and the fragmentation of kingship are the same event, seen from different angles? The Sumerian texts do not present the gods as unified in their intentions toward humanity. Enlil, the king of the gods, often wants to destroy or limit mankind. Enki, the god of wisdom, often intervenes to preserve or help humanity. In the flood narratives, it is Enki who warns the hero Ziusudra to build an ark, even though Enlil decreed the flood to wipe out mankind. The gods are in conflict over what humanity should be allowed to achieve. This is not the monotheistic framework of Genesis, where one god makes one decision. This is a polytheistic framework where divine politics shape human history. And in that framework, the confusion of tongues is not simply punishment. It is a move in an ongoing divine debate about human potential. Before we examine that debate directly, we need to understand the text where it is most clearly articulated, not Genesis. Genesis is the echo. The earlier voice comes from a Sumerian epic about a king named En-mer-ka and his attempt to build a temple that would rival the heavens. When all the land had one speech, the composition is catalogued in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative as literary text W0369. Its modern title is En-mer-ka and the Lord of Aratta. Multiple exemplars survive. Tablets housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, P345116, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, P269666, and several others scattered across collections. The text was composed during the Neo-Sumerian period, around 2000 BCE, though the events it purports to describe occur much earlier, in the legendary past shortly after the flood, when the great kings of Uruk contended with distant lands. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the pioneering Assyriologists who translated Sumerian literature in the 20th century, published the first full English rendering of the epic in 1952. Since then, it has been revised and refined as more tablet fragments were discovered, and the most reliable scholarly translation is now available through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by Oxford University's Faculty of Oriental Studies. The story itself is long over 600 lines. It concerns a rivalry between Enmerkar, king of Uruk, and the unnamed lord of Aratta, a distant mountain kingdom rich in precious stones and metals. Both cities are under the patronage of the goddess Inanna, but Inanna favours Enmerkar. He wishes to beautify her temple in Uruk with materials from Aratta, gold, silver, lapis lazuli. Rather than wage war, Enmerkar sends a series of increasingly complex messages to the Lord of Aratta, demanding tribute and submission. The messages become so elaborate that at one point the herald cannot remember the entire speech, and this difficulty leads to the invention of writing. This detail alone makes the text fascinating. The Sumerians themselves present writing as a response to the failure of oral memory, not as some abstract breakthrough, but as a pragmatic solution to a communication problem. But what concerns us is not the invention of writing. It is a passage that occurs earlier in the text, when Enmerkar is building his temple and appeals to the god Enki for assistance. The passage begins at line 136 of the Oxford translation. Enmerkar is speaking. In those days, having no rival on earth, the land Martu was lying down in safe pastures, the whole universe, the people in unison spoke to Enlil in one tongue. Let that sentence settle. The people in unison spoke to Enlil in one tongue. Enmerkar is describing a time not the distant past, but within his own memory or the memory of his immediate ancestors, when all humanity spoke a single language, not metaphorically. The text is explicit. One tongue, one speech. Linguistic unity across the whole universe, which in Sumerian cosmology means the known world, the lands within the cosmic order. The passage continues. Enmerkar is recounting this unity, and then he makes a request. He prays to Enki, and the text records his words. May the lands of Shubur and Hamazi, the many-tongued, the land, Sumer, the great mountain of the Me of magnificence, the land, Akkad the bound, the land, Martu lying in safe pastures, may they all address Enlil together in a single language. Here is the pivot. Enmerkar is not describing the present. He is describing a past state linguistic unity that no longer exists. By his time, the lands speak many tongues, Shubur, Hamazi, Sumer, Akkad, Martu. These regions now have different languages, and Enmerkar wants that diversity reversed. He wants them to speak one language again. Why? Because he is building a temple. He has a monumental construction project, and he needs the organizational capacity that linguistic unity provides. The text continues, and Enki's response is recorded. On that day, when there is no snake, when there is no scorpion, when there is no hyena, when there is no lion, when there is neither dog nor wolf, when there is thus neither fear nor trembling, man has no rival. This is a poetic way of describing paradisiacal conditions. A world without danger, without predators, without the threats that keep humanity fragmented and struggling. In such a world, man has no rival. Humanity's only competition is itself, or perhaps the gods. And then Enki acts. The next lines are fragmented in the surviving tablets, but the reconstructed text reads, Then did Enki, the Lord of abundance, the Lord of steadfast decisions, the Lord of wisdom, change the speech in their mouths, as many as he had placed there, and the speech of mankind was truly one. This is the moment. Enki changes the speech. He introduces multiplicity. The unity Enmerkar longs for is deliberately fractured, not by Enlil who desires order, but by Enki, the god of wisdom and craft. Why would the god of wisdom confuse language? The text does not explain Enki's motive explicitly, but the structure of the narrative implies it. Enmerkar, king of a powerful city, equipped with the architectural knowledge to build a temple rivaling the heavens, supported by the goddess Inanna, is seeking to compel other lands to contribute to his project. He wants them unified in language so they can be organized, so his instructions can be followed without ambiguity, so the work can proceed efficiently. If Enmerkar succeeds, he will have created a centralized power capable of monumental achievements. A unified language enables unified action. Unified action enables the execution of grand plans. And grand plans, in the hands of a single king, might make humanity too formidable, too organized, too capable of things the gods have not sanctioned. So Enki fragments the speech. Not in anger. The text does not describe this as punishment. It describes it as a decision, a steadfast decision made by the Lord of Wisdom, a strategic intervention. Mainstream scholarship approaches this passage with caution. The standard interpretation is that the Enmerkar epic is not about a historical event, but about the transition from a mythic golden age to the reality of linguistic diversity. In this view, the passage explains why the world has many languages, because Enki changed them, but does so in the context of a legend, not a chronicle. The story serves an etiological function, providing a narrative origin for observable reality. This reading is reasonable. Ancient myths often explain contemporary conditions by projecting them back into a narrative past. The Enmerkar text could simply be a Sumerian way of accounting for why Sumer, Akkad, Hamazi, and other regions spoke different languages. But there are details in the text that resist being dismissed as pure legend. First, the cities and regions named are real. Sumer and Akkad are the southern and northern regions of Mesopotamia, well attested historically. Hamazi is mentioned in multiple Sumerian texts as a distant but real kingdom. Martu is the Sumerian term for the Western nomadic peoples. These are not mythical places, they are geographic realities. Second, the narrative structure is not cosmogonic. It is not describing the creation of the world or the origin of humanity. It is describing a change in a political and linguistic situation. Enmerkar is appealing to Enki to restore a previous condition, implying that within the cultural memory preserved in this text, there was a time when these regions did share a common language and that unity was lost. Third, the passage is embedded in a story about construction and resource mobilization. Enmerkar is not trying to build a tower out of hubris. He is trying to beautify a temple, and he needs tribute from distant lands. His desire for linguistic unity is practical, not spiritual. He wants communication efficiency. He wants organizational capacity. And that is precisely what Enki denies him. There is another version of the linguistic unity tradition preserved in Sumerian literature, much more fragmentary, found in a composition sometimes called the Incantation of Eridu, or the Spell of Nudimud. The text is damaged, but the surviving lines include a reference to a time when mankind with one tongue gave praise, and a subsequent fragmentation. The text is not narrative like Enmerkar, it is liturgical, a ritual incantation. But it attests to the same tradition: there was a time of one tongue, and it ended. This is not an isolated motif, it is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian textual tradition. Different compositions from different periods preserve the memory of linguistic unity and its loss. Why would this memory persist? One possibility is that it reflects the historical experience of the Sumerian language itself. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It is not Semitic, not Indo-European, not related to any other documented language family. When Akkadian-speaking Semitic peoples moved into Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE, the result was a bilingual culture. Sumerian remained the language of liturgy, scholarship, and high culture, while Akkadian became the vernacular. Eventually, Sumerian ceased to be spoken entirely, surviving only as a learned language, like Latin in medieval Europe. Perhaps the memory of one tongue is the Sumerian cultural memory of a time before Akkadian, when Sumerian was the sole language of the region. The fragmentation would then represent the historical arrival of other languages and the gradual decline of Sumerian as a unifying medium. This is plausible. but it does not explain why the fragmentation is attributed to divine action, nor why it is specifically connected to construction projects and the limiting of human capability, unless the historical experience of linguistic fragmentation coincided with a political collapse. If there was a period when Sumerian was the administrative language of a unified or semi-unified region, and that unity fractured into competing city-states speaking different dialects or languages, the result would be precisely what the texts describe: an inability to coordinate large-scale projects, a breakdown in communication, a limitation of collective human achievement. The Enmerkar text in this reading preserves the memory of that fracture. It explains why the great coordinated projects of the past, projects that would have required precise communication across regions, are no longer possible. Not because people lack the knowledge, but because they lack the linguistic unity to execute them. And it attributes that fragmentation to a deliberate divine decision. Not punishment for pride, but strategy to limit capability. This is the context that Genesis 11 inherits. The Tower of Babel story is not original to the Hebrew Bible. It is a Hebrew retelling of a much older Mesopotamian tradition preserved in texts like Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta that explain why humanity no longer speaks one language and why monumental construction projects that once seemed possible no longer are. But Genesis makes a change. In the Sumerian version, Enki changes the language. In Genesis, it is God singular, unified, monotheistic, who confuses the tongues, and the motive shifts slightly. Genesis frames it explicitly. If, as one, people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Nothing will be impossible. That is not a statement about pride. That is a statement about capability. Linguistic unity makes collective human action unstoppable, and the divine response is not to correct pride, but to prevent that capability from being realized. Why would that be necessary? What were they trying to build that was so dangerous? To answer that, we must turn to the archaeology, to the ruins in Iraq where Robert Koldewey spent 18 years uncovering what was buried under the sands, to the ziggurat that the ancients called Etemenanki and that the world would later call the Tower of Babel, the mathematics of reaching heaven. In March of 1899, a German archaeological expedition arrived in Babylon, then a desolate region of mounds and rubble about 90 kilometers south of modern Baghdad. The team was led by Robert Koldewey, an architect turned archaeologist known for his meticulous excavation methods. Koldewey would remain at Babylon for 18 years, until the interruptions of World War I forced him to leave in 1917. In that time, he uncovered one of the most important ancient cities ever excavated. Among his many discoveries, walls, palaces, the famous Ishtar Gate Koldewey identified the foundation of a massive structure in the center of the city. It was a square platform, heavily eroded, with only the lowest quarters of brickwork remaining. But when measured, the dimensions were striking. The base was 91, 48 meters on each side, almost exactly 91 meters. A perfect square. Koldewey identified this as the foundation of Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon dedicated to the god Marduk. Ziggurats were not unique to Babylon. They were a standard form of Mesopotamian religious architecture. Massive stepped platforms topped with a temple shrine. The best preserved example is the ziggurat at Ur, reconstructed in the 20th century to give modern visitors a sense of what these structures looked like. But Etemenanki was the largest, and according to the ancient sources, the most ambitious. The name Etemenanki is Sumerian. It means temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. Not reaching toward heaven, not aspiring to heaven. The foundation of heaven and earth. The text implies the ziggurat was understood as a cosmic axis, a point where the divine and earthly realms met. Koldewey's excavation revealed only the foundation because the upper structure had been completely dismantled over centuries. Alexander the Great, when he conquered Babylon in 3031 BCE, reportedly ordered the rubble cleared in preparation for rebuilding the tower, but he died before the work was completed. The bricks were gradually carried off and reused in other constructions. By the time Caldwell arrived, nothing remained above ground level, but Caldwell did not rely solely on archaeology. He also had access to ancient texts that described the tower's dimensions. The most important of these is a cuneiform tablet known as the Esagila tablet, a Neo-Babylonian mathematical text dated to around 229 BCE found in Uruk. The tablet is part of a tradition of architectural and astronomical documents that preserve measurements of temples and ziggurats. The Esagila tablet gives the dimensions of both the Temple of Marduk, Esagila, and the ziggurat Etemenanki. According to the Esagila tablet, Etemenanki had a base of 91 meters square. The height, reconstructed from the description of 7 ascending stages, was also approximately 91 meters. A cube-shaped structure, rising from the Babylonian plain. But here is what made it extraordinary. The tower was not simply stacked mud brick, it was an engineered marvel requiring precise calculations, load-bearing analysis, and coordinated labour across years, perhaps decades. Each of the 7 levels had specific dimensions. Each level was set back from the one below, creating the characteristic stepped profile of a ziggurat. The top level supported a temple structure, the Shrine of Marduk, which itself required architectural precision. To build such a structure requires several things. First, mathematics. You need to calculate the volume of material, the angles of the setbacks, the distribution of weight. Mesopotamian mathematics was sophisticated. They used a base 60 numerical system, the origin of our 60 seconds in a minute, and 360 degrees in a circle. Cuneiform tablets from Sumerian and Babylonian schools show students working through geometric problems, calculating areas and volumes. This was not primitive guesswork. This was advanced engineering. Second, standardized measurements. If you are coordinating thousands of workers making millions of bricks, every brick needs to be the same size. Mesopotamian bricks were indeed standardized. We find them in ratios of 1,000:4 for thickness, width, and length. This standardization enabled modular construction. You could prefabricate components and assemble them on site. Third, material logistics. The Esagila tablet records that Etemenanki required approximately 85 million bricks. Even if that number is symbolic or exaggerated, the order of magnitude is clear. You need clay sources, water, straw for temper, drying facilities, kilns for fired bricks, transport systems to move the material to the construction site, and storage facilities to stockpile inventory. Fourth, labour organisation. Tens of thousands of workers divided into specialised teams. Brickmakers, brick carriers, masons, engineers, overseers, suppliers. Each team needs to know its role. Each worker needs to understand instructions. Mistakes in a structure this size are catastrophic. A miscalculated angle means collapse. A weak point in the foundation means the entire tower fails. And fifth, critically linguistic clarity. Imagine you are an overseer directing a crew. You need to tell them to place a row of bricks with a specific orientation at a specific height, with a specific offset from the row below. If your instructions are misunderstood, the error compounds. One misaligned row affects every row above it. Multiply this across hundreds of crews working simultaneously on different sections of the tower, and the necessity of precise communication becomes absolute. This is not like building a small house where errors can be corrected as you go. This is coordinated large-scale construction where errors cascade. Now, the Esagila tablet gives us dimensions, but it does not tell us how Etemenanki was actually built. For that, we turn to other sources. One is the MS 2063 stele, the Tower of Babel stele from the Cheyenne collection, which we encountered at the beginning. That stone does not just depict the tower. It includes a diagram at the bottom, a floor plan showing the square base divided into sections. This is a construction document. It shows how the foundation was laid out, how the space was organized. Another source is the Cuneiform inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar II himself. Multiple inscriptions survive in which Nebuchadnezzar describes his restoration of Etemenanki. One, now in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, reads, "I completed the building of Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon. I laid its foundation on the breast of the underworld, and I made its top as high as the heavens." The breast of the underworld, the top as high as the heavens. This is the language of cosmic connection, of a structure that spans the vertical axis of the universe. But Nebuchadnezzar is clear that he is restoring the tower, not building it for the first time. He describes removing rubble, clearing the foundation, and rebuilding what had fallen into ruin. This is a theme in Mesopotamian royal inscriptions. Kings present themselves as restorers of ancient works, not innovators. The implication is that Etemenanki is much older than Nebuchadnezzar's reign. How much older? Texts from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, mention Etemenanki. The Sumerian king list, which we have already discussed, references temples being built in Eridu and Uruk in the antediluvian period. While Etemenanki itself is not explicitly named in the oldest texts, the tradition of building ziggurats to connect heaven and earth is ancient in Mesopotamia. Archaeologically, ziggurats appear in the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE. The White Temple at Uruk, built atop a platform that could be considered a proto-ziggurat, dates to around 3200 BCE. The ziggurat at Ur, one of the best preserved, was built by Ur-Nammu around 2500 BCE. These structures were not rare. Nearly 30 ziggurats have been identified across Mesopotamia. But Etemenanki was the largest, the most ambitious, and the one that became synonymous with the concept of a tower reaching heaven. Why did Mesopotamians build ziggurats? The standard explanation is religious. The ziggurat was the dwelling place of the god. The temple at the top was where the god descended to meet with priests. The structure physically elevated the sacred space, separating it from the mundane. Rituals at the summit connected the city to the divine. This is certainly part of the function. But there is another dimension. Ziggurats were also administrative centers. Temples in Mesopotamia were not just places of worship, they were economic institutions. They owned land, employed workers, collected taxes, distributed rations, stored grain, and managed trade. The temple complex was the economic engine of the city. And the ziggurat, the most visible structure in the city, symbolized that power. To build a ziggurat was to demonstrate organizational capacity. It showed that your city could mobilize resources, coordinate labor, and execute a multi-year project. It was a statement of political and economic power as much as religious devotion. And that brings us back to the question of language. If Etemenanki required the organizational capacity we have described, and if that capacity depended on precise linguistic communication, then any fragmentation of language would make such a project difficult or impossible. You cannot build a 91-meter tall tower if your engineers and laborers speak different languages. You cannot coordinate logistics if your suppliers do not understand your orders. You cannot maintain structural integrity if instructions are garbled in translation. This is what the Enmerkar text describes, a king attempting a monumental project, recognizing that linguistic diversity impedes his ability to execute it, and appealing to the gods to restore linguistic unity. And this is what Genesis describes. A unified people speaking one language beginning to build a tower reaching to heaven, and God recognizing that linguistic unity makes them capable of anything they plan to do. The Sumerian and Hebrew accounts agree on the mechanism. Linguistic fragmentation stops the project. Where they differ is in framing. Genesis presents the confusion of tongues as a response to the tower. Enmerkar presents it as a preemptive decision by Enki, not specifically about one tower, but about the general danger of humanity being too unified and too capable. But both traditions agree that the confusion of tongues is not about punishing pride. It is about limiting capability. And both traditions place the event in the context of post-flood reconstruction. After the deluge, humanity attempts to rebuild, and something interrupts that rebuilding, something deliberate, something the gods or God decided was necessary. To understand why, we need to examine what the flood destroyed and what knowledge was preserved through it, what the flood washed away and what it preserved. In the University of Pennsylvania Museum, resting in a climate-controlled display case, is a clay tablet catalogued as CBS 10673. It measures about 16 centimeters tall, inscribed on both sides with 6 columns of Sumerian cuneiform, though large portions of the text are damaged. The tablet was excavated in the early 20th century from the ruins of Nippur, one of the most important religious centers of ancient Sumer. It dates to the Old Babylonian period, approximately the 17th century BCE. This tablet is known by several names. Scholars call it the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian creation myth, or the Sumerian flood story. It is the oldest known account of the deluge, predating the Akkadian flood narratives and the biblical flood by centuries, perhaps more than a millennium if the tradition it preserves is older than the tablet itself. The text begins, as much as we can reconstruct from the damaged portions, with the creation of humanity and the establishment of cities. It describes kingship descending from heaven. It lists 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, each ruled by a king. These are the same cities mentioned in the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list. The text treats them as real places, governed by real institutions, inhabited by people who practiced agriculture, built temples, and worshipped the gods. Then the tablet describes a divine council. The gods are disturbed by humanity. The text is fragmentary here, but the implication is that mankind has become too numerous, too noisy, or perhaps too powerful. The god Enlil decrees that humanity must be destroyed. He will send a flood to wipe out civilization. But Enki, the god of wisdom, does not agree with Enlil's decision. Enki reveals the plan to a man named Ziusudra, who is king of Shuruppak. The text describes Ziusudra as pious, God-fearing, and attentive to divine communication. Enki tells Ziusudra to build a large boat and to save himself, his family, and the seed of all living things. The tablet is severely damaged in the section describing the flood itself, but the surviving lines indicate a storm lasting 7 days and nights, water covering the earth, and the destruction of the cities. When the flood recedes, Ziusudra opens a window in the boat and sees the sun. He offers sacrifices to the gods. The gods, seeing that he has survived, grant him eternal life and place him in Dilmun, a distant paradise. The final lines of CBS 1063 are fragmentary, but they indicate that after the flood, kingship is restored. The cities are refounded. Civilization begins again. This is the narrative structure: creation, establishment of cities, divine decision to destroy, a righteous survivor preserves life, restoration after destruction. It is the same structure found in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, in the Babylonian flood account embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in Genesis 6-9. The tradition is consistent across cultures and centuries. There was a time before the flood when cities existed, knowledge flourished, and humanity was organized under kings. Then the flood destroyed that world, a remnant survived, and from that remnant, civilization was rebuilt. But, and this is the crucial point, the post-flood world is not the same as the pre-flood world. The Sumerian king list makes this clear. Before the flood, kings reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns are shorter. Before the flood, kingship was stable in a few cities. After the flood, kingship shifts rapidly between cities, suggesting political fragmentation. What does this mean? One interpretation is that the flood represents a historical catastrophe, perhaps a massive regional flooding event in Mesopotamia that destroyed the early Sumerian settlements and required survivors to rebuild. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kish, and Shuruppak shows sediment layers consistent with severe flooding, though scholars debate whether these represent a single catastrophic event or multiple floods over time. If there was such an event, it would have disrupted the transmission of knowledge. Scribes, priests, artisans, engineers, the people who held specialized knowledge would have been killed. Libraries, workshops, temples would have been destroyed. The survivors would have been farmers, fishermen, traders, people with practical skills but not necessarily the specialized knowledge required for advanced administration, monumental architecture, or astronomical calculation. The post-flood world, in this scenario, would be a world attempting to restore what was lost. Some knowledge survived, passed down orally or preserved in whatever records could be salvaged, but other knowledge was gone and had to be relearned through trial and error. This could explain why the Sumerians present their own civilization as a restoration rather than an invention. They are not claiming to have discovered writing, agriculture, and kingship. They are claiming to have received these arts from the gods, meaning, perhaps, that they inherited fragmentary knowledge from a pre-flood civilization and rebuilt based on that inheritance. The Eridu Genesis does not explicitly discuss the confusion of tongues, but it establishes the context in which that confusion occurred. After the flood, during the period of restoration, at a moment when humanity was rebuilding the cities, re-establishing kingship, and attempting to recover the organizational capacity that had been lost. And here is where the Enmerkar text and the Eridu Genesis connect. Enmerkar, according to the king list, ruled Uruk in the early post-flood period. His attempts to build monumental temples and to organize labor from distant lands occur in the context of a world still recovering from the flood. He is not working with a fully intact civilization, he is working with a fragmented, rebuilding civilization. And he recognizes that one of the obstacles to his project is linguistic diversity. This suggests that the confusion of tongues did not occur in a stable, advanced civilization. It occurred in a civilization that was already fragile, already struggling to recover lost knowledge and capability. The fragmentation of language was an additional blow, a further impediment to restoration. Why would the gods impose that impediment? Let us return to the divine politics described in the Mesopotamian texts. Enlil, king of the gods, is consistently portrayed as wary of humanity. He decrees the flood to reduce or eliminate mankind. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil's motive is explicitly stated: humans are too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. Whether this is meant literally or is a metaphor for human overpopulation or overreach, the point is that Enlil sees humanity as a problem to be managed, not a creation to be nurtured. Enki, by contrast, is humanity's advocate. He warns Yusudra of the flood. He gives humanity the me, the arts of civilization. He intervenes repeatedly to protect or help mankind, often in defiance of Enlil's wishes. But even Enki has limits. In the Enmerkar text, it is Enki who changes the speech in the mouths of mankind, not Enlil, who wants to destroy humanity. Enki, who usually helps humanity. Why? Because Enki's goal is not to make humanity powerful. His goal is to make humanity survivable. He wants humans to continue existing, to thrive within limits, but not to become so powerful that they provoke Enlil's wrath or destabilize the cosmic order. Linguistic fragmentation is a way to achieve that balance. Humanity survives. Cities are rebuilt. Civilization continues. But the capacity for large-scale coordination is diminished. Monumental projects like Etemenanki become more difficult. The risk of humanity achieving something the gods consider dangerous is reduced. This reading transforms the confusion of tongues from punishment into protective intervention. Enki is not punishing Enmerkar or humanity. He is limiting their capability to prevent a more severe divine response, like another flood. The biblical account in Genesis shifts this dynamic slightly. In Genesis, there is no divine council debating humanity's fate. There is one God who observes what humanity is building and decides to intervene, but the logic is the same. God sees that unified language makes humanity capable of anything they plan to do, and that capability is deemed too dangerous. Genesis 11,006-7 records God's reasoning. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This is not a condemnation of pride. This is an acknowledgement of capacity. Linguistic unity removes the barriers to collective action, and collective action, when coordinated by human ambition, can achieve things that the divine order has not authorized. The question is, what were they planning to do that was so concerning? Genesis says they were building a city and a tower, with its top in the heavens, so that they could make a name for themselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Let us unpack those motivations. Make a name for themselves. This is often interpreted as pride or self-glorification. But in ancient Near Eastern context, to make a name is to establish legacy, to ensure continuity, to create a monument that survives. It is about permanence. They want to build something that will endure, that will mark their existence, that will prevent them from being forgotten. Not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This is often read as defiance of God's command in Genesis 9 to fill the earth. But it can also be read as a desire for unity, for staying together, for maintaining the social cohesion that enables large projects. They do not want to fragment into isolated tribes, they want to remain a unified people. Seen this way, the tower is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of consolidation. They are building a central monument to unify the people, to create a shared identity, to resist the natural forces of dispersion that would scatter them across the landscape. And God's response is to impose exactly what they were trying to prevent: scattering. By confusing their language, God ensures that they cannot remain unified. They must disperse. The city is abandoned. The tower remains unfinished. The Mesopotamian version, preserved in Enmerkar and related texts, provides the missing motivation. Enmerkar wants linguistic unity specifically for construction. He needs it to mobilize resources, to communicate instructions, to execute his monumental project. And the God of wisdom denies him that unity. Both traditions agree, linguistic unity enables dangerous capability. Fragmentation limits that capability. And the divine realm chooses fragmentation, but fragmentation comes at a cost. If the pre-flood world had achieved a level of knowledge and organization that required linguistic unity to maintain, then the post-flood fragmentation would have made restoring that level impossible. The knowledge might have survived in fragments preserved in texts, passed down through oral tradition, remembered by a few survivors, but the ability to apply that knowledge on a large scale would have been lost. This is what the Sumerian texts lament. They describe themselves as living in the shadow of a greater age. The antediluvian kings could maintain dynasties for tens of thousands of years. The post-flood kings struggled to maintain power for decades. The great works of the past, the temples that reach to heaven, cannot be fully restored. The confusion of tongues is not the cause of this decline. It is an additional factor compounding the effects of the flood. Together, the flood and the linguistic fragmentation ensure that humanity remains manageable, limited in its reach, incapable of repeating whatever it was that provoked divine concern in the first place. What was that? What did the pre-flood civilization achieve that made the gods decide to destroy it? The texts do not say explicitly, but they give us clues. The Eridu Genesis describes the antediluvian cities as places where kingship was established, where temples were built, where the Mi were practiced. The Sumerian king list gives us extraordinary reign lengths, suggesting either extreme longevity or long-lasting institutions. The Enmerkar text describes a time when all lands spoke one language and addressed the gods in unison. Put these together, and you get a picture of a highly organized, technologically capable civilization with centralized knowledge, stable institutions, and the ability to coordinate large-scale projects. a civilization that could build temples reaching to heaven, a civilization that, from the gods' perspective, had become too powerful. The flood destroyed it. The confusion of tongues prevented its full restoration. And the memory of that destruction and that fragmentation echoes through the texts of Mesopotamia and into the pages of Genesis. What we call the Tower of Babel story is not a simple tale of pride and punishment. It is the Hebrew retelling of a much older Mesopotamian tradition about the limits the divine realm imposes on human capability and the mechanisms, flood, fragmentation, scattering, by which those limits are enforced. The tower itself, whether Etemenanki or some earlier structure, is the symbol of what humanity can achieve with unity and knowledge. And the confusion of tongues is the symbol of what prevents that achievement from being repeated. But symbols rest on foundations. And those foundations in this case are not just narrative, they are architectural. They are the actual temples and ziggurats that the Mesopotamians built or attempted to build with mathematics and engineering that required precise communication and coordination. The temples that teach architectural memory across generations. There is a cuneiform tablet in the British Museum, catalogued as BM 1927, 2027-27, 1. It is a Neo-Babylonian school text, inscribed with a description of the features of the temple complex at Babylon called Sagil, the house of the great lord, the temple of Marduk that stood adjacent to Etemenanki. The tablet is not literary, it is didactic. It is a teaching text, used to train scribes in the technical vocabulary of temple architecture. The text lists rooms, courtyards, gates, and dimensions. It describes materials, cedar beams, gold plating, lapis lazuli inlays. It gives the names of shrines within the complex and explains their ritual functions. This is not poetry. This is technical documentation. Why would such a text exist? Because temples in Mesopotamia were not just built and then forgotten. They were maintained, repaired, expanded, and periodically rebuilt. Each generation of priests and builders needed to know the original plan, the sacred dimensions, the proper materials. If that knowledge was lost, the temple could not be correctly restored. And if the temple was not correctly restored, the rituals would not be effective, the gods would not be properly honoured, and the city's fortune would decline. Temples, in other words, were repositories of knowledge. They taught their own construction through the texts and traditions maintained by the priesthood. The architecture itself became a form of memory. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. Many ancient cultures encoded knowledge in their sacred structures. The pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic sites of Europe, the temples of Mesoamerica. All of these required mathematical and astronomical knowledge to design and build, and all of them served as enduring records of that knowledge even after the cultures that built them declined. But Mesopotamian ziggurats have a particular characteristic that makes them unusually suited to this function. They are modular. Each level is a distinct platform built on top of the previous one. The structure grows upward in stages, and each stage can be understood as a separate architectural unit. This modularity means that the knowledge required to build a ziggurat can be segmented into lessons. You teach someone to build the first level, then the second, then the third. Each level reinforces the principles while adding complexity. Ancient ziggurats were not built in a single campaign. They were built over years, sometimes decades. Kings would begin a ziggurat and their successors would complete it. Ur-Nammu began the ziggurat at Ur. His son Shulgi completed it. This multi-generational construction required that knowledge be passed down reliably. You could not simply improvise, you had to follow the plan. And the plan was not arbitrary. Ziggurats followed specific proportional systems. The base dimensions related to the height in consistent ratios. The setbacks between levels followed geometric progressions, the orientation aligned with cardinal directions and often with celestial phenomena. Solstice sunrises, the rising of particular stars, the path of the moon. We know this because we can measure the ruins and because the cuneiform texts describe the design principles. The Esagila tablet, which we have mentioned, is one of many such architectural texts. Another is a tablet from the Seleucid period, catalogued in the Louvre, which gives the dimensions of temples in several cities and explains the mathematical relationships between different parts of the structures. These texts were not casual descriptions, they were specifications. If you wanted to build or restore a temple, you consulted these tablets, you learned the measurements, the proportions, the sacred geometry, and you replicated them precisely. Why such precision? From a religious perspective, the temple was the dwelling of a god. The structure had to meet divine specifications. If you built it incorrectly, the god would not inhabit it, and your city would lose divine favour. So every dimension, every material, every ritual associated with construction was carefully prescribed. From a practical perspective, precision ensured structural stability. A ziggurat is a massive load-bearing structure. If the foundation is not level, if the walls are not plumb, if the weight distribution is uneven, the building will crack and eventually collapse. Ancient Mesopotamian engineers understood this. They used plumb lines, measuring rods, leveling instruments. They calculated the volume of fill needed, the thickness of walls required, the placement of buttresses. And from an educational perspective, precision made the structure a teaching tool. If every ziggurat followed the same principles, then learning to build one ziggurat taught you to build others. The knowledge was transferable. A scribe trained in Uruk could travel to Babylon and understand the plans there, because both used the same architectural language. But that language was literal. It was linguistic. The terms for foundation, platform, stairs, shrine, mud brick, fired brick, bitumen, measurements, these had to be standardized. If different cities used different words for the same concepts, communication would break down. Plans could not be shared. Knowledge could not be transferred. This is why linguistic unity was so important for monumental construction. It was not just that workers needed to understand orders, though that was part of it. It was that the entire system of knowledge transmission depended on a shared vocabulary. The architectural texts we have, like BM 1927 Mine 2 are written in Sumerian and Akkadian, but they presume a reader who knows the technical terminology. If that terminology varied from city to city, the text would be useless. Now, let us think about what happens when language fragments. Imagine you are a priest in the city of Uruk, and you have access to a tablet describing the dimensions of Etemenanki in Babylon. The tablet is written in Sumerian, which you can read. But your workers speak Akkadian. You need to translate the instructions. In the process, you encounter a term that has no precise equivalent in Akkadian. Perhaps a specific type of brick, or a measurement unit, or a construction technique. You approximate. You use a similar word. Your workers interpret that word based on their own experience. The result is not quite what the plan specified. Multiply this across dozens of technical terms, across hundreds of workers, across years of construction. The errors accumulate. The structure deviates from the plan. Stability is compromised. Or, alternatively, you decide you cannot risk error, so you slow down. You communicate through bilingual intermediaries. Every instruction is checked and double-checked. The project takes longer. Costs increase. Coordination becomes more difficult. Eventually, the project becomes impractical. Either way, linguistic fragmentation makes monumental construction harder. And if the fragmentation continues, if not just two languages but many languages emerge, as the Genesis account describes, then the system breaks down entirely. You can still build small structures. You can still maintain local temples. But the great coordinated projects, the ziggurats that rival Etemenanki, become impossible. This is what the texts are describing. Not a mythological divine punishment, but a practical consequence of linguistic diversity in a world that relied on precise technical communication. And it explains why the Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, were so concerned with preserving linguistic continuity. Sumerian even after it ceased to be spoken, remained the language of scholarship, liturgy, and technical documentation. Scribes were required to be bilingual, fluent in both Sumerian and Akkadian. The lexical lists, cuneiform tablets that function as dictionaries giving Sumerian words with Akkadian equivalents, were among the most copied texts in Mesopotamia. Why go to such effort to preserve a dead language? Because the knowledge encoded in that language could not be fully translated. Sumerian technical vocabulary had nuances, distinctions, conceptual frameworks that did not map perfectly onto Akkadian. If Sumerian were lost entirely, the temple plans, the ritual instructions, the mathematical texts would become unintelligible. The ability to maintain and restore the temples would be lost. This is what the confusion of tongues threatened. Not just the inability to communicate in daily life, but the loss of the specialized knowledge that enabled civilization. Now, think about this in the context of the post-flood world. The Erodogenesis tells us that the flood destroyed the antediluvian cities. The Sumerian king list tells us that after the flood, kingship had to descend from heaven again, implying that institutions had to be rebuilt from scratch. If linguistic fragmentation occurred during this rebuilding process, it would have made restoring the pre-flood level of civilization extraordinarily difficult. Perhaps some of the knowledge survived, preserved by survivors like Ziusudra. Perhaps they had texts or memories of how things were done before. But if the language in which that knowledge was encoded was no longer unified, if the technical vocabulary had fragmented into regional dialects or entirely different languages, then the knowledge could not be applied. You would have a situation where people knew that the ancients had built great towers, but they could not replicate the process because the instructions were no longer intelligible. You would have architectural ruins that inspired awe, but no clear understanding of how to rebuild them. This is, in fact, what we see in the archaeological record. The largest ziggurats, like Etemenanki, are attributed to very early periods and then repeatedly restored by later kings. Nebuchadnezzar does not claim to have invented Etemenanki. He claims to have cleared the rubble and rebuilt it according to ancient plans. His inscriptions emphasize that he is following tradition, not innovating. The same pattern appears in Egypt with the pyramids. The Great Pyramids of Giza were built in the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE. Later dynasties built smaller pyramids, less ambitious, less precise. The knowledge of how to build on the scale of Khufu's pyramid seems to have been lost or at least diminished. Why does knowledge decline? One reason is social disruption. War, famine, plague, invasion, any of these can kill the specialists who hold knowledge, destroy the texts that record it, and break the institutional continuity that transmits it. The collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, led to the loss of much engineering and administrative knowledge in Western Europe. It took centuries to recover. Another reason is linguistic fragmentation. If the language in which knowledge is encoded changes or fragments, the knowledge becomes inaccessible unless it is deliberately translated and re-encoded. This requires effort, resources, and political will. If a civilization is struggling to survive, it may not have the capacity to undertake such a project. The Tower of Babel story, in this reading, is about a moment when linguistic fragmentation imposed a limit on civilizational recovery. Humanity, in the aftermath of the flood, attempted to rebuild the great works of the past. But the confusion of tongues made that rebuilding incomplete. The towers could be started, but not finished. The knowledge could be remembered, but not fully applied. And the divine realm, according to both the Sumerian and Hebrew traditions, chose to impose that limit. Not arbitrarily, but strategically. Because unified linguistic and organizational capacity had led to something that required divine intervention to stop. What was that something? We will explore interpretations. But first, we must examine how mainstream scholarship understands these texts and where that understanding encounters difficulties. Mainstream interpretation. Mythology as metaphor. Academic Assyriologists approach the Sumerian and Akkadian texts we have been discussing with a particular methodological framework. That framework treats ancient myths as cultural products, stories that serve social, political, and psychological functions, rather than as historical records. This is not a dismissive stance, it is a careful, scholarly position developed over more than a century of textual and archaeological research. The standard interpretation of the confusion of tongues motif, as it appears in texts like En-Merkar and the Lord of Aratta, is that it functions etiologically. An etiological myth explains the origin of a current condition. Why do different regions speak different languages? Because in the distant past, the god Enki changed the speech in the mouths of mankind. The story provides a narrative explanation for linguistic diversity, making that diversity comprehensible within the Sumerian religious worldview. Similarly, the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis 11 is understood as an etiology for both linguistic diversity and the geographic dispersion of peoples. Why are there so many languages? Why are people scattered across the earth? Because long ago, at Babel, God confused their single language and scattered them. The story answers questions that ancient audiences would naturally ask about the world they observed. Scholars point out that etiological myths are common in ancient literature. Why do snakes shed their skin? Because, in a myth, a snake stole the plant of immortality that was meant for humans. Why does the moon wax and wane? Because a god was injured in battle and periodically recovers. These stories are not meant to be scientific explanations. They are narrative frameworks that integrate observable phenomena into a culture's mythic history. In this view, the En-Merkar text is not describing an actual historical event where everyone spoke one language and then suddenly did not. It is describing the Sumerian cultural memory of a time, perhaps the early 3rd millennium BCE, when Sumerian was the dominant language of southern Mesopotamia, before Akkadian speaking. Semitic peoples arrived and the region became bilingual. The confusion of tongues is a mythologized account of linguistic change over time, compressed into a single divine act to make the story more coherent and memorable. The Genesis account, similarly, is understood as a Hebrew adaptation of the older Mesopotamian tradition. The Israelites encountered these stories during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when the educated elite lived in Babylon and had access to cuneiform libraries. They adapted the Mesopotamian motifs, especially the flood and the confusion of tongues, into their own monotheistic framework, transforming a story about polytheistic divine politics into a story about the singular God's relationship with humanity. This interpretation has strong support. We know that Genesis shares many structural and thematic elements with Mesopotamian literature. The flood narrative in Genesis closely parallels the Atrahasis epic and the flood account in Gilgamesh. The creation account in Genesis 1 has similarities to Enuma Elish. The legal codes in Exodus share features with the Code of Hammurabi. The influence is undeniable. Moreover, linguistic science confirms that languages do change over time, diverge into dialects, and eventually become mutually unintelligible. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, all descended from Latin and diverged over centuries as the Roman Empire fragmented. No divine intervention was necessary. Natural linguistic evolution explains the diversity. So, the mainstream scholarly consensus is that the confusion of tongues is a mythological explanation for a natural process. The story served to make linguistic diversity comprehensible in a pre-scientific culture that attributed all significant changes to divine action. This is a reasonable interpretation. It accounts for the evidence without requiring belief in supernatural events. It situates the text within their cultural context and explains their function. But there are aspects of the text that this interpretation struggles to fully explain. First, the specificity of the context. The En-Merkar text does not simply say that languages diversified over time. It places the confusion of tongues in a specific scenario, a king attempting to build a monumental temple, requesting divine assistance to unify language for that purpose, and being denied. The fragmentation is not gradual or natural. It is a deliberate divine decision made in response to a specific human project. If this were purely etiological, we would expect a more generic explanation. Long ago, people spoke one language, but the gods decided to make them speak many languages, and that is why we have linguistic diversity today. Instead, we get a detailed political and architectural context. Enmerkar needs materials from Aratta. He needs to communicate complex instructions. He appeals to Enki. Enki changes the language. The specificity suggests the story is rooted in something more than generic etiology. Second, the pattern of independent attestation. The confusion of tongues motif appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts from different periods. The Enmerkar epic from the Neo-Sumerian period. Fragments of the Eridu traditions referencing linguistic unity. The later Genesis account. These are not all copying from a single source. They represent independent witnesses to a tradition that spans more than 1,000 years of cultural memory. Why would such a specific tradition persist for so long if it were only a generic explanation for linguistic diversity? Cultures have many ways to explain language differences. They can attribute it to geographic isolation, to ancestral migrations, to tribal distinctions. The Mesopotamian tradition could have said that each city-state received its own language from its patron god, and that would explain diversity just as well. Instead, it insists on a unified origin. One language spoken by all, followed by a deliberate fragmentation. Third, the architectural connection. The confusion of tongues is consistently linked to monumental construction, Enmerkar and his temple, the Tower of Babel. The theme is not just about language, it is about building, about reaching toward heaven, about projects that require coordination and precision. Why would an etiological myth specifically connect linguistic diversity to architectural ambition? That connection only makes sense if there is a memory of actual building projects that were hindered by communication difficulties. Otherwise, the two themes, language and towers, are unrelated. Fourth, the post-flood context. Both the Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions place the linguistic fragmentation after the flood during the period of civilizational restoration. This is not a random narrative choice. The flood represents a catastrophic break in continuity. After the flood, humanity has to rebuild, and during that rebuilding, something goes wrong. Language fragments. The tower is not completed. Civilization does not fully recover its pre-flood capacity. If this were simply mythology, the timing would not matter. But the texts are insistent on the sequence: flood, restoration, fragmentation. That sequence implies causation, or at least a relationship between the events. Fifth, the motive attributed to the divine realm. In the Enmerkar text, it is Enki, the god of wisdom and humanity's advocate, who changes the language. In Genesis, it is God observing that unified humanity can achieve anything they plan. Neither account frames this as arbitrary divine whim. Both present it as a strategic decision based on human capability. The mainstream interpretation acknowledges these details, but suggests they are narrative embellishments that make the story more engaging. A simple etiology, the gods made languages different, is not as compelling as a story with kings, temples, divine councils, and monumental towers. The embellishments serve a literary function. This is plausible. But it leaves open the question, if the embellishments are fictional, why these specific embellishments? Why not others? Why is the story always about construction, about reaching heaven, about capability that the gods find concerning? There is another difficulty. The texts do not read like pure mythology. They read like chronicles. The Sumerian king lists kings, dynasties, cities, reign lengths, some of which are historically accurate. The Enmerkar epic names real places, real trade goods, real architectural projects. The Eridu Genesis describes real cities that we have excavated. Even when the texts describe extraordinary events, 28,800-year rains, 7-day floods, linguistic unity, they embed those events in frameworks that are otherwise realistic. This mixing of the plausible and the implausible is what makes the texts difficult to interpret. If they were entirely fantastical, we could dismiss them as pure fiction. If they were entirely realistic, we could treat them as history. But they are both, woven together in a way that resists clean categorization. The mainstream approach is to accept the realistic details as reflections of actual practice and social structure, while treating the extraordinary details as symbolic or exaggerated. The kings in the king list are real, but the reign lengths are not. The cities in Enmerkar are real, but the divine interventions are not. The ziggurats existed, but the idea that their construction was halted by divine confusion of language is mythological. This approach works most of the time. But it encounters problems when the extraordinary claims are specific, detailed, and independently attested. When multiple texts from multiple periods agree on a particular sequence of events, and when those events have architectural and political contexts that make practical sense, the dismissal of them as only myth starts to feel incomplete. What if the texts are preserving a memory of something that actually happened, but describing it in the only language available to them? The language of divine action. Ancient peoples attributed all significant events to the gods. A drought was the gods withholding rain. A military defeat was the gods withdrawing favour. A flood was the gods sending judgment. This does not mean the drought, defeat, or flood did not happen. It means the interpretation was theological. Could the confusion of tongues be a real event? A historical moment when linguistic unity was lost, described in theological terms, because that is how the Sumerians and Hebrews understood causation. If so, what would that event have looked like? Perhaps a political collapse that fractured a previously unified empire, leading to isolated regions developing divergent dialects. Perhaps a migration event that brought new peoples with different languages into contact with existing populations. Perhaps a deliberate policy decision by a ruling elite to fragment populations to prevent rebellion. All of these have historical parallels. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE led to political fragmentation and the resurgence of local Sumerian dialects. The arrival of the Amorites in the early 2nd millennium brought new linguistic influences. Later, the Aramean migrations further diversified the linguistic landscape. Any of these events could be remembered as the confusion of tongues, especially if they coincided with the abandonment or failure of a major construction project. If Etemenanki, or an earlier ziggurat, was begun during a period of unity and left incomplete due to political collapse and linguistic fragmentation, that would match the pattern the texts describe. The mainstream interpretation does not deny that such historical events occurred, but it does not see the texts as reliable witnesses to them. The texts, in this view, are not trying to record history, they are trying to make sense of the present by projecting explanations into a mythic past. This may be true, but it does not exhaust what the text might be telling us. Because the texts are not just explaining linguistic diversity, they are asking a deeper question. Why are humans no longer capable of the things the ancients achieved? The Sumerians looked at the ruins of Uruk, the massive walls that enclosed the city, and believed they had been built by a legendary king named Gilgamesh. They looked at the antediluvian sites and believed they had been ruled by kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. They believed their own civilization was a diminished version of something greater that had existed before. The Genesis narrative has the same sensibility. After Babel, humanity is scattered and fragmented. The great unified project is abandoned. Civilization becomes smaller, less coordinated, less capable. Whether this represents historical memory or cultural pessimism is debatable. But the theme is consistent. There was a time when humanity could do more than it can now. and the loss of that capability is connected to the loss of linguistic unity. Mainstream scholarship explains this as nostalgia for a golden age, a common mythological trope. Every culture imagines a better time in the past. The Greeks had the Age of Gold. The Norse had the time before Ragnarok. The Hindus have the Satya Yuga. These are not histories. They are idealized visions that serve psychological and moral functions. Perhaps the confusion of tongues is just that, a story, a metaphor. A way to explain why the world is not as unified or as capable as we might wish. But there are details in the texts. Procedural details, architectural details, political details that do not fit neatly into that interpretation. Details that suggest the storytellers thought they were recording something real, even if we no longer have the context to fully understand what that reality was. Let us examine those details more closely and see where the mainstream interpretation struggles. The problem of procedural specificity. When we read ancient texts as literature or mythology, we often focus on their grand themes: creation, destruction, divine will, human fate. We analyze symbolism, structure, character, and message. This is appropriate for texts that function as literature. But the Mesopotamian texts we have been discussing are not purely literary. Many of them are administrative, legal, or technical documents. And even the narrative texts contain procedural details that serve no obvious literary function. Consider the Enmerkar epic again. A substantial portion of the text is devoted to describing the back-and-forth messages between Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. Enmerkar demands tribute. The Lord refuses. Enmerkar sends another demand, more elaborate. The Lord responds with a riddle. Enmerkar solves it and sends a counter-challenge. The negotiations go on for hundreds of lines with increasing complexity. At one point, the message Enmerkar sends is so long and intricate that the herald cannot remember it all. The text describes the herald's distress, and Enmerkar's solution: he inscribes the message on a clay tablet. This is the invention of writing according to the narrative. Not a divine gift, not a sudden inspiration, but a pragmatic response to the limits of human memory in the context of complex diplomatic communication. Why include this level of procedural detail? From a literary standpoint, it is tedious. The story could simply say Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta exchanged messages and move on. But instead, we get the content of each message, the responses, the rhetorical strategies, the logistical problems. This is not how you write engaging mythology. This is how you document a diplomatic process. The same pattern appears in other Mesopotamian texts. Administrative tablets from temple archives record the delivery of grain, allocation of rations, assignment of work crews, and payment of wages. Legal tablets record the terms of contracts, the resolution of disputes, the transfer of property. These are not stories. These are records of actual procedures. And even the narrative texts, epics, hymns, myths, often include procedural details that feel more like documentation than storytelling. The Eridu Genesis describes the creation of humanity, the establishment of cities, and the flood. But it also includes lists, the names of the 5 cities, the names of their kings, the sequence of events. These lists serve a record-keeping function, not a narrative one. The Sumerian king list is an extreme example. Much of it is just names, places, and numbers. It is a list, not a story. But even the brief narrative sections, then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended, read like chronological notation, not dramatic literature. What does this mean for how we interpret these texts? It suggests that the Sumerians and Babylonians were concerned with recording information, not just with telling compelling stories. They wanted to preserve knowledge of what had happened, who had ruled, what had been built, and how. The texts function as institutional memory, not just as entertainment. Now apply this to the confusion of tongues. In the Enmerkar epic, the linguistic fragmentation is not described in vague mythological terms, it is described in a specific political context. Enmerkar is negotiating with Aratta. He needs their resources. He wants to compel them to submit to his authority. He appeals to Enki to unify language so that he can more effectively coordinate the project. Enki's response is to change the speech, introducing multiplicity. This is procedural. It describes a request, a decision, and a consequence. It fits the pattern of the diplomatic negotiations that fill the rest of the text. Enmerkar asks for something. A divine authority, in this case, Enki decides whether to grant it. The decision has political and logistical consequences. If this were purely metaphorical or symbolic, we would not expect such specificity. We would expect something more like the Greek myth of Prometheus, where the theft of fire is symbolic of the acquisition of knowledge and the details are less important than the moral theme. But the Enmerkar text is not structured that way, it is structured like a chronicle. Similarly, Genesis 11 includes procedural details. The people settle in the plain of Shinar. They say to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They use brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. They begin to build a city and a tower. Why specify the materials? In Mesopotamia, brick and bitumen are the standard building materials because stone is scarce. But in Canaan, where Genesis was likely compiled, stone is abundant and brick is less common. The detail that the Tower of Babel was built with brick and bitumen is not necessary for the story, but it is accurate to Mesopotamian construction practice. It suggests that the story preserves a memory of actual building techniques from a specific place. The text also says the people wanted to build a tower with its top in the heavens. This is often interpreted as hyperbole, reaching heaven as a metaphor for extreme height or ambition. But in Mesopotamian context, ziggurats were literally called stairways to heaven. They were designed to be the place where heaven and earth met. The phrase is not metaphorical. It is describing the function of the structure. These procedural and technical details do not prove the story is historical, but they do suggest that the storytellers were drawing on knowledge of actual practices, not inventing from whole cloth. They knew about Mesopotamian construction. They knew about ziggurats. They knew about the political and logistical challenges of large-scale projects, and they connected those challenges specifically to linguistic unity and fragmentation. Why? Because linguistic standardization is a requirement for large-scale coordination. This is not speculation. It is an observable fact in human history. Every empire that has attempted to govern diverse populations has faced the challenge of language. The Roman Empire used Latin as the administrative language. The Mongol Empire used Mongolian and Persian. The British Empire used English. Standardized language enables standardized law, taxation, trade, and military coordination. When empires collapse, one of the consequences is linguistic fragmentation. The Romance languages emerged from the fragmentation of Latin after the fall of Rome. The Slavic languages diversified after the decline of early medieval polities. Linguistic unity and political unity are deeply connected. Mesopotamia experienced this pattern multiple times. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon around 2334 to 2000 unified. Sumer and Akkad under a single administration. Akkadian became the lingua franca used alongside Sumerian. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed, regional powers reasserted themselves and linguistic diversity increased. Later, the third dynasty of Ur, around 212 to 204 BCE, re-established centralized control. Sumerian experienced a revival as the administrative language. When Ur fell, fragmentation returned. Each cycle of unification and collapse would have been experienced as a shift between linguistic standardization and diversity, and each collapse would have disrupted large-scale construction projects because the institutional continuity required to complete them was lost. If the confusion of tongues tradition preserves a memory of such a collapse, specifically a collapse that halted a major ziggurat project, then the procedural details in the texts make sense. They are describing real administrative challenges, the difficulty of coordinating labour when workers speak different languages, the problem of transmitting technical knowledge when terminology is not standardized, the breakdown of trade networks when merchants cannot communicate. The mainstream interpretation acknowledges these historical realities, but does not see the texts as directly reflecting them. The texts, in this view, are theological narratives shaped by the cultures that produced them, not historical documents. But the line between theology and history in ancient Mesopotamian thinking was not as clear as we might assume. When a Sumerian scribe recorded that Enki changed the speech in the mouths of mankind, he may have believed he was recording a real event caused by a god that had tangible consequences in the world. The divine causation was the interpretive framework, but the event itself, linguistic fragmentation, was real. This is the difficulty. We can dismiss the divine causation as mythology. But if we do, we are left with the question, why did the scribes think they needed a myth to explain linguistic diversity? Why not simply accept it as a natural fact? Unless they were trying to explain something more specific. Not just, why are there many languages? But, why did linguistic unity end? Not, why do people speak differently? But why can we no longer build what the ancients built? The texts are not just explaining the present, they are lamenting a loss, and the loss they lament is not primarily linguistic. It is architectural, political, organizational. It is the loss of the capability to execute grand projects. The confusion of tongues is the mechanism by which that capability was lost. And the Tower of Babel, whether Etemenanki or an earlier structure, or a symbolic representation of all such structures, is the monument to what might have been achieved if the confusion had not occurred. This reading does not require us to believe in divine intervention, but it does require us to take seriously the possibility that the texts are preserving a memory of historical events, political collapse, the abandonment of construction projects, the fragmentation of a previously unified culture, and the resulting inability to recover what was lost. If that is what the texts are describing, then the confusion of tongues is not a myth explaining linguistic diversity. It is a chronicle of civilizational decline, told in theological language, because that is how the ancients understood causation. And if that is true, then we need to reconsider what the tower represents and why its incompletion mattered so much that it echoed through 1,000 years of textual tradition. An alternative reading. Strategic fragmentation. Let us entertain a possibility, not as proven fact, but as interpretive framework. What if the confusion of tongues was not a mythological explanation for linguistic diversity, but a memory of a deliberate policy decision? Human history contains many examples of ruling powers fragmenting populations to prevent unified resistance. The Assyrian Empire, in the 1st millennium BCE, practiced mass deportations, relocating conquered peoples to distant parts of the empire. This broke social cohesion, disrupted local power structures, and made rebellion difficult. The deported populations could not easily coordinate with each other because they were separated by distance and, often, by language. The Babylonian Empire continued this practice. The deportation of the Jewish elite to Babylon in 586 BCE is the most famous example. But it was standard policy for dealing with subjugated peoples. The goal was not primarily punitive, it was strategic. You weaken a population's ability to organize by scattering them and mixing them with other populations. The Roman Empire used language policy as a tool of control. Latin was imposed as the administrative language, but local languages were tolerated. This created a two-tier system. Those who spoke Latin had access to power, while those who spoke only local languages were marginalized. Over time, this linguistic hierarchy reinforced political hierarchy. The British Empire did something similar, promoting English in its colonies while allowing local languages to persist. The result was that the colonial elite, educated in English, became intermediaries between the imperial centre and the local population. Linguistic fragmentation was not accidental. It was maintained because it served imperial interests. Now, imagine a pre-flood or early post-flood civilization that had achieved a high degree of linguistic unity and organizational capacity. Perhaps not a single centralized empire, but a network of city-states that shared a common language, trade systems, and religious traditions. This civilization undertakes monumental projects, temples, ziggurats, irrigation networks that require coordination across regions. From the perspective of the divine realm, or in political terms that we might now call the ruling elite or the priesthood, this level of human capability becomes concerning. Unified language enables unified action. Unified action enables the accumulation of power. And accumulated power might challenge divine or priestly authority. What if the confusion of tongues was not a supernatural event, but a policy decision? What if the priesthood, the intermediaries between gods and humans, deliberately fostered linguistic diversity to limit the organizational capacity of the population? This would explain several aspects of the tradition that are otherwise puzzling. First, why the fragmentation is attributed to Enki, the god of wisdom, rather than Enlil, the god who typically limits or punishes humanity. If the decision was strategic rather than punitive, Enki is the appropriate agent. He is the god who thinks ahead, who plans, who balances competing interests. He helps humanity survive, but he also ensures they do not become too powerful. Fragmenting their language accomplishes both goals. Second, why the fragmentation occurs in the context of construction. A tower reaching heaven is not just a religious symbol. It is a demonstration of engineering capability, labour organisation, and political power. If a king can build such a structure, he demonstrates that he can coordinate vast resources and command absolute obedience. That level of power might threaten the priestly class, who derive their authority from their role as intermediaries with the divine. If the king can reach heaven directly, through a ziggurat, he does not need priests. Third, why the tradition persists across cultures and centuries. If the fragmentation was a historical event with lasting political consequences, it would be remembered. Not necessarily accurately, but the general outline. There was unity, then fragmentation, and the fragmentation prevented the completion of great works would be passed down. Fourth, why the texts frame the fragmentation as strategic rather than punitive. The Enmerkar text describes Enki's decision as steadfast, made deliberately after Enmerkar's request. Genesis describes God's decision as reasoned. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Both accounts present the fragmentation as a calculated choice based on an assessment of human capability, not as angry punishment for transgression. In this reading, the Tower of Babel story is not about hubris. It is about the divine realms, or the ruling classes' recognition that humanity had reached a threshold of capability that required intervention. The intervention was linguistic fragmentation, which limited the ability to coordinate large-scale projects without destroying humanity itself. How would such a policy be implemented? One method would be to encourage regional dialects by isolating populations. If a centralized administration collapses and each city-state becomes independent, linguistic drift would occur naturally over time. Within a few generations, dialects diverge. Within a few centuries, they become mutually unintelligible. But there is a faster method, the deliberate alteration of scribal training. If priests and scribes are the ones who control literacy, they control the standardization of language. They could introduce regional variations in cuneiform signs, in vocabulary, in grammatical forms. They could teach different cities to write the same words differently. Within a single generation, administrative communication would become more difficult. Within 2 or 3 generations, texts written in one city might be unintelligible in another. We actually see evidence of this in the cuneiform record. Sumerian cuneiform used in Ur looks slightly different from Sumerian used in Uruk or Lagash. Akkadian dialects, Babylonian in the south, Assyrian in the north diverge significantly. Scribal schools preserve these regional differences, even when political unification might have encouraged standardization. Why preserve diversity if standardization would be more efficient? Perhaps because diversity served a function. It limited the ability of any one ruler to command resources across the entire region. It forced trade and diplomacy to go through intermediaries, priests, scribes, translators who could control the flow of information. It maintained a balance of power. If this sounds cynical, consider that it is precisely how power operates in human societies. Those who control information control power. The Catholic Church maintained Latin as the liturgical language for centuries, even as vernacular languages diverged because Latin literacy was restricted to the clergy. This gave the Church a monopoly on scriptural interpretation. When the Bible was translated into vernacular languages during the Reformation, the Church's power was challenged. In Mesopotamia, the priestly class controlled literacy. The temples were schools. Scribes were trained by priests. The knowledge of reading and writing cuneiform was restricted to a small elite. If that elite wanted to limit the power of secular rulers, fragmenting administrative language would be an effective tool. This is speculative. We have no direct evidence of such a policy. But we do have evidence that linguistic standardization was valued when centralized power wanted to assert itself. The Akkadian Empire promoted Akkadian, the third dynasty of Ur promoted Sumerian. Later, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires promoted standardized dialects of Akkadian. And we have evidence that during periods of political fragmentation, linguistic diversity increased. The intermediate periods between empires show greater dialectal variation, less standardization, and more regional idiosyncrasies in texts. This pattern suggests that linguistic unity and political unity were linked, and that both could be deliberately manipulated by those in power. Now, let us connect this to the post-flood context. The flood, in Mesopotamian tradition, destroyed the antediluvian civilization. After the flood, humanity had to rebuild. During that rebuilding, kingship descended from heaven again, and cities were refounded. This is a period of potential centralization. A strong king could consolidate power, unify the region, and establish a new order. But the priestly class would have an interest in preventing that. If power consolidates too much, the priests lose influence. If a king can build a tower to heaven on his own, he does not need the temples. So the priests, acting, in their understanding, on behalf of the gods, introduced linguistic fragmentation. Not overnight, but gradually, by encouraging regional differences, by decentralizing scribal training, by allowing dialects to diverge. The result is that no king can unify the region linguistically. Trade continues, diplomacy continues, but the level of coordination required for monumental projects declines. The great towers remain incomplete or require centuries to finish. Civilization continues, but at a reduced scale. This is what the texts describe. Not a sudden divine punishment, but a gradual fragmentation that limits capability. And the tradition remembers this as the confusion of tongues, attributed to divine action, because the scribes who recorded it were themselves part of the priestly class that implemented it. This reading is controversial. It treats the gods as ciphers for human institutions, which is not how the texts present themselves. But it has the advantage of explaining why the confusion is described in strategic terms, why it is linked to construction, and why it occurs during a period of attempted centralization. Whether we accept this reading or not, it is worth considering because it takes seriously the procedural details in the texts. It does not dismiss the confusion of tongues as mere mythology. It treats it as a description of real political and linguistic processes, interpreted through a theological lens. If this reading has merit, then the Tower of Babel story is not about divine punishment for human pride. It is about strategic intervention to prevent centralized power. It is about the gods, or the priests, recognizing that unified humanity is capable of things that challenge divine authority and taking steps to prevent that capability from being realized. This transforms the tower from a symbol of hubris into a symbol of potential. The unfinished tower represents what humanity might have achieved if linguistic unity had been maintained, and its incompletion represents the deliberate choice, by the divine realm or by those who spoke for the divine realm, to limit that potential. But even if the fragmentation was deliberate, it raises a question. Was it justified? Were the gods or the priests right to fear what unified humanity might achieve? To answer that, we need to look at the evidence for what antediluvian or early post-diluvian civilization was capable of, and whether that capability truly warranted intervention. The pattern. Across 3 millennia. We have examined individual texts, the Enmerkar epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, Genesis 11. But patterns become clearer when we step back and look at the broader tradition. Across 3 millennia from the earliest Sumerian compositions around 2600 BCE to the final compilation of Genesis around 500 BCE, a consistent narrative thread appears in Mesopotamian and Levantine literature. The thread has 4 elements. 1. An original state of unity, often linguistic. 2. Human achievement or ambition, connected to construction. 3. Divine intervention that imposes limits. 4. Fragmentation and the resulting decline in capability. This pattern appears not only in the texts we have already discussed, but in other compositions as well. Consider the Barton cylinder, catalogued as CBS 8383 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. This is one of the earliest Sumerian creation texts, dating to the mid-3rd millennium BCE. The text is fragmentary, but the surviving portions describe the creation of humanity by the goddess Ninmah and the god Enki, the establishment of civilization, and the distribution of roles and functions. The text does not mention the confusion of tongues explicitly, but it does describe a process by which the gods assign different functions to different regions. Sumer is given agriculture, Martu is given pastoralism, Dilmun is given trade. This functional differentiation creates diversity, but not conflict. Each region has its role in a coordinated system. The implication is that in the original divine plan, diversity was intentional, but it was organized. The different regions had different languages and cultures, but they were meant to work together as part of a larger order. What disrupts this order is not clear from the Barton cylinder because the text is too damaged. But the theme of organized diversity followed by disorganization appears here, as it does in later texts. Now, consider Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved in multiple copies, including K5419C in the British Museum. Enuma Elish describes the creation of the world, the rise of Marduk to supremacy among the gods, and the creation of humanity. After Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat and establishes cosmic order, the gods build Babylon as Marduk's city. They construct Esagila, his temple, and Etemenanki, his ziggurat. The text describes this construction as a divine project, not a human one. The gods themselves are the builders. But the function of Etemenanki is to serve as a meeting place between heaven and earth. It is a point of connection, a ziggurat that enables communication and transit between the divine and human realms. Later in the text, Marduk creates humanity to serve the gods, to perform the labor that the lesser gods no longer want to do. Humanity is given specific roles, to maintain the temples, to offer sacrifices, to cultivate the land. In return, the gods provide order, fertility, and protection. This is a hierarchical system. Humanity serves the gods provide structure, and the ziggurat, the tower connecting heaven and earth, is the physical symbol of that relationship. But Enuma Elish also hints at tension. Marduk's supremacy is not uncontested. Other gods resent his authority. The text describes how Marduk proves his power by destroying and recreating a constellation of stars, demonstrating his control over cosmic order. The other gods submit, but the implication is that submission was not automatic. It had to be compelled. If the gods themselves struggle with issues of authority and power, how much more would humanity? And if humanity, given the tools of civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture, administration, were to organize themselves effectively, might they also contest divine authority? Enuma Elish does not explicitly address this question, but the structure of the text implies it. Cosmic order is established through conflict and hierarchy. Marduk rules because he is powerful enough to enforce his rule. Humanity is created to serve, and their role is maintained through ongoing divine oversight. What happens if humanity stops serving? What happens if they decide to build their own towers, not as places to worship the gods, but as monuments to their own capability? This is where the Tower of Babel story intersects with Enuma Elish. The ziggurat in Enuma Elish is built by the gods for divine purposes. The tower in Genesis is built by humans for human purposes, to make a name for themselves, to unify their people, to prevent scattering. The divine response is to scatter them anyway, to impose the very fragmentation they were trying to avoid, and in doing so, to ensure that humanity remains in its assigned role, serving the gods, not rivaling them. This theme, humanity attempting to rise above its station and the gods imposing limits, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh is structured around this tension. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. He is a king of extraordinary capability. He builds the walls of Uruk, undertakes quests that no ordinary human could survive, and seeks immortality. But every time Gilgamesh reaches for something beyond human limits, he is stopped. He cannot keep the plant of immortality, a snake steals it. He cannot bring his friend Enkidu back from the dead. He cannot escape mortality. The gods allow Gilgamesh to achieve great things, but they do not allow him to transcend his humanity. He can build walls, but he cannot live forever. He cannot be remembered, but he cannot be divine. The pattern is consistent. Humanity can achieve much, but there are limits, and those limits are enforced by the divine realm. Now, this pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in Greek mythology as well. Prometheus steals fire and gives it to humanity, and Zeus punishes him. Icarus flies too close to the sun and falls. The Titans rebel against the gods and are cast into Tartarus. The theme of divine limits on human, or quasi-divine, ambition is widespread in ancient literature. But what makes the Mesopotamian tradition distinctive is its focus on language and construction. The Greek myths do not usually connect divine intervention to linguistic fragmentation. They focus on other mechanisms, chains, exile, transformation. The Mesopotamian tradition specifically connects capability to language and intervention to the disruption of language. This suggests that for Mesopotamian cultures, language was understood as a technology, a tool that enables coordination and therefore power. And if language is a technology, then the confusion of tongues is not just a cultural change, it is a technological disruption. It is the deliberate breaking of a tool that had made humanity too capable. This is the pattern we see across 3 millennia. Humanity is given the tools of civilization. Humanity uses those tools to build impressive structures. The divine realm observes and decides that humanity has become too capable. The divine realm intervenes not by destroying humanity entirely as in the flood, but by limiting their tools. The flood limits population and continuity. The confusion of tongues limits coordination and communication. Together, these interventions ensure that humanity cannot return to the level of capability that existed before. This is not punishment in the moral sense. It is management. It is the divine realm, or those who speak for the divine realm, maintaining a balance of power. And the texts present this as a recurring pattern. The Eridu Genesis describes the flood and restoration. The Sumerian king list describes the shift from antediluvian to post-diluvian dynasties. The Enmerkar epic describes the confusion of tongues. Enuma Elish describes the construction of Etemenanki by the gods as a model for human temples. Genesis describes the flood and the Tower of Babel. Each of these texts is part of a larger narrative tradition that explains why the world is the way it is, why humanity is powerful but not too powerful, why we can build but not build everything, why we have cities and temples and writing but also war and scarcity and fragmentation. The tradition does not present this as inevitable. It presents it as the result of specific decisions made by the divine realm at specific moments in history. The flood was a decision. The confusion of tongues was a decision. These were interventions, not accidents. And the memory of those interventions shapes how the cultures that preserved these texts understood their own limitations. They knew they were capable of great things. They had the ruins to prove it. But they also knew they could not replicate the greatest achievements of the past. And they explained that inability not as lack of knowledge or skill, but as the consequence of divine decisions to limit their capability. This is a remarkable framework. It acknowledges human potential while explaining why that potential is not fully realized. It offers hope. We can achieve great things. While tempering that hope with realism, we are not allowed to achieve everything. Whether this framework reflects historical events or is purely a narrative construction designed to make sense of the world, it has shaped 3,000 years of thought about human achievement, divine authority, and the limits imposed on both. And at the center of this framework is the tower, the unfinished monument. The symbol of what might have been if the gods had not intervened, if language had remained unified, if humanity had been allowed to complete what they began. What would have happened if the tower had been finished? What were they trying to build? And what did they hope to achieve? To answer that, we must ask what capabilities were lost when the fragmentation occurred and whether those capabilities are recoverable. Why? This question matters. Lost capabilities. The Sumerian texts we have been examining are not nostalgic fantasies. They are records produced by a literate, technologically sophisticated civilization that built cities, managed irrigation systems, conducted international trade, and maintained libraries. When these texts describe a past of greater capability, they are not inventing a golden age from nothing. They are comparing their present to evidence that surrounded them. Archaeological excavations have confirmed much of what the texts describe. Uruk, in the 4th millennium BCE, was one of the largest cities in the world, with monumental architecture including the White Temple and massive defensive walls. The Ziggurat at Ur, built by Ur-Nammu around 2000 BCE, still stands in partial form, demonstrating the engineering skill of its builders. The irrigation networks that supported Sumerian agriculture were sophisticated, covering thousands of square kilometers and requiring coordinated maintenance across multiple city-states. These achievements are not disputed. What is disputed is whether there was an even earlier period of greater achievement that was lost, either in a catastrophic flood or through political and linguistic fragmentation. The Sumerian king list says there was. It describes antediluvian cities ruled by dynasties that lasted tens of thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship treats these numbers as symbolic, but the cities themselves are real. Eridu, the first city according to the king list, shows evidence of continuous occupation from 5400 BCE. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shurupak are all real archaeological sites with early occupation layers. If these cities were inhabited for thousands of years before the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, and if they maintained some level of civilizational continuity during that time, then they would have developed specialized knowledge, agricultural techniques, metallurgy, construction methods, astronomical observations, mathematical systems. Much of that knowledge could have been transmitted orally, through master-apprentice relationships and institutional traditions. But oral transmission is vulnerable. A single generation of disruption, war, famine, epidemic, or flood can sever the chain. Knowledge that took centuries to accumulate can be lost in decades. This is not hypothetical. We have historical examples. The collapse of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE resulted in the loss of literacy in the Aegean. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, disappeared. For several centuries, Greece had no writing. When literacy returned, it was with a different script, the Greek alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, and no continuity with the earlier tradition. The knowledge recorded in Linear B tablets, administrative records, inventories, religious texts was lost. Similarly, the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West resulted in the loss of much engineering knowledge. Aqueducts, roads, and public buildings fell into disrepair, and the techniques to maintain or replicate them were forgotten. It took centuries for European civilization to recover the organizational capacity to undertake comparable projects. The Mesopotamian flood tradition describes a comparable collapse. If the antediluvian cities were destroyed by flooding, and if the survivors were a small remnant, much of the accumulated knowledge would have been lost. The post-flood civilization would have to rebuild, relying on whatever memory, texts, or expertise survived. Some knowledge clearly did survive. The Sumerians of the early dynastic period, 22900–2350 BCE, had writing, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, and monumental architecture. They were not starting from zero, but they may have been starting from a diminished base, attempting to reconstruct techniques and systems that had once been more advanced. The clearest evidence for this is linguistic. The Sumerian language has no known relatives. It is isolated. This is unusual. Most languages belong to families, groups of related languages that descended from a common ancestor. Sumerian stands alone. This suggests either that Sumerian is extremely ancient, predating the diversification of other language families, or that its relatives died out, leaving no record. If the flood destroyed other early civilizations and their languages, Sumerian might be the lone survivor of a much older linguistic tradition. The post-flood. Sumerians would then be the inheritors of a language and knowledge system that had no contemporary parallels. This would explain why Sumerian texts present themselves as preserving ancient knowledge rather than inventing new knowledge. The scribes saw themselves as custodians of a tradition that predated them, not as innovators. Now, if the confusion of tongues occurred during the period of post-flood restoration, it would have compounded the loss of knowledge. Linguistic fragmentation would have made it harder to share information, to coordinate projects, and to maintain institutional continuity across regions. Consider what happens when a technical vocabulary is lost. Modern archaeology has encountered this problem when trying to replicate ancient construction techniques. How were the stones at Stonehenge transported and erected? How were the pyramids built? How did Roman engineers design aqueducts that still function 2,000 years later? In each case, we have the physical structures, but we do not have the detailed procedural knowledge. We can analyze the structures, make hypotheses, and test them experimentally. But we do not have access to the training texts, the master builder's instructions, the institutional knowledge that was passed down orally or in texts that have not survived. The same would have been true in post-flood Mesopotamia. The survivors might have known that monumental ziggurats could be built. They might have had partial knowledge of how. But without the full technical vocabulary, the detailed procedures, and the coordinated institutional framework, replicating the antediluvian achievements would have been difficult. Linguistic fragmentation would have made it even harder. If different cities developed different terms for the same construction techniques, then knowledge could not be easily transferred. A scribe in Uruk might have access to texts describing ziggurat construction, but if those texts used Sumerian terms that had no precise equivalents in the dialect spoken in Akkad, the knowledge would be locked in place, inaccessible to outsiders. Over time, this leads to knowledge silos. Each city maintains its own traditions, but the broader system of shared knowledge breaks down. Innovation slows because there is less cross-pollination of ideas. Ambitious projects become harder because they require coordination that is no longer possible. This is what the texts lament. Not that humanity lost all knowledge, but that humanity lost the capability to coordinate knowledge across regions and generations. The tools of civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture survived, but the organizational capacity to use those tools on the largest scale did not. The Tower of Babel, in this reading, is the symbol of that lost capacity. It represents the ability to mobilize resources from multiple regions, to communicate precise instructions across linguistic and cultural boundaries, to coordinate thousands of workers on a multi-generational project. The incompletion of the tower represents the fragmentation that made such projects impossible. Could those capabilities be recovered? In theory, yes. If linguistic unity were restored, if standardized terminology were re-established, if institutional continuity were rebuilt, the capability would return. And in fact, we see this happen periodically in Mesopotamian history. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon, the third dynasty of Ur under Ur-Nammu, the Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi. Each of these represents a moment of reunification when centralized power imposed linguistic standardization and undertook monumental projects. But each unification was temporary. Each empire eventually fragmented, and each fragmentation resulted in the loss of capability, requiring the next empire to rebuild from a diminished base. The pattern suggests that the capability to build on the largest scale is fragile. It depends on conditions: political unity, linguistic standardization, institutional continuity, that are difficult to maintain over long periods. When those conditions break down, the capability is lost, and recovering it requires centuries. This is why the question matters. If the Tower of Babel story preserves a memory of a moment when humanity had the capability to achieve something extraordinary, and that capability was deliberately disrupted, then we are being told that human potential is greater than current circumstances suggest. The limits we experience are not natural, they are imposed. Whether those limits are justified is a separate question. Perhaps the gods or the ruling powers were right to fear what unified humanity might achieve. Perhaps the confusion of tongues prevented outcomes that would have been worse than the fragmentation itself. But the texts leave that question open. They do not condemn the tower builders. They do not celebrate the confusion. They simply record that it happened, and that the result was a diminished capability, a world in which humanity achieves much but could have achieved more. For 3,000 years, that has been the legacy of Babel. Not a simple morality tale about pride, but a complex narrative about the tension between human potential and divine limits, between what we might achieve and what we are allowed to achieve, between the unified capability that enables great works and the fragmentation that keeps us manageable. And at the center of that narrative is the unfinished tower, standing as a monument to the question, what might we have built if we had been allowed to finish? The three interpretations. Weighing what we know. We have travelled through Sumerian tablets, archaeological ruins, and textual traditions spanning millennia. We have examined what the texts say, what mainstream scholarship makes of them, and what alternative readings might suggest. Now we must step back and consider how to weigh the evidence. There are three primary frameworks for interpreting the confusion of tongues and the Tower of Babel traditions. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology and symbolic function. In this view, the confusion of tongues is an etiological myth, a story that explains why the observable world is the way it is. Ancient peoples noticed that different regions spoke different languages, and they needed an explanation that fit their religious worldview. Since they attributed all significant events to divine action, they created a narrative in which a god, Enki, or God, in Genesis, deliberately fragmented human language. The Tower of Babel serves a similar function. It explains why monumental ancient structures like Etemenanki exist but appear incomplete or in ruins. The narrative provides a theological reason: humanity attempted to build to heaven, and God stopped them. In this framework, the procedural details, the brick and bitumen, the architectural specifications, the political context, are narrative embellishments that make the story more engaging and culturally grounded. They do not point to historical events. They point to the storyteller's knowledge of their own cultural practices, which they projected into the mythic past. This interpretation is careful and cautious. It does not require belief in supernatural events. It accounts for the texts as cultural products shaped by the societies that produced them. Strengths: this interpretation aligns with the scholarly consensus. It treats mythology as a legitimate form of cultural expression without insisting on literal historicity. It acknowledges that ancient peoples thought differently than we do, and that their narratives serve functions beyond simple historical record-keeping. Weaknesses: it struggles to explain the specificity and consistency of the tradition. Why does the confusion of tongues always occur in the context of construction? Why is it linked to post-flood restoration? Why does the motive attributed to the divine realm focus on human capability rather than moral transgression? Etiological myths can be generic, but this one is remarkably specific. That specificity suggests something more than a generic explanation for linguistic diversity. Interpretation. 2. Encoded wisdom and philosophical teaching. In this view, the confusion of tongues is not about historical events, but about perennial human truths. The story teaches that unity enables great achievements, but that unity is fragile and difficult to maintain. It warns against overreaching ambition and the dangers of centralized power. It reflects on the trade-offs between coordination and diversity, between large-scale capability and local autonomy. The Tower of Babel becomes a parable about the limits of human organization. The tower itself represents any large-scale project that requires perfect coordination. The confusion of tongues represents the inevitable entropy that disrupts such projects. Miscommunication, conflict, divergent interests, fragmentation. In this framework, the procedural details serve a pedagogical function. They ground the abstract lesson in concrete imagery. The brick and bitumen, the architectural ambition, the geographic specificity. All of these make the teaching memorable and applicable to real-world situations. This interpretation treats the texts as sophisticated philosophical literature rather than as history or simple mythology. It credits the ancient authors with insight into human nature and social dynamics. Strengths. This interpretation takes seriously the complexity of the texts without requiring literal belief in divine intervention. It allows the stories to speak to us across millennia as reflections on human experience. It acknowledges that wisdom traditions often encode their teachings in narrative form, using concrete stories to convey abstract principles. Weaknesses. It does not fully account for why the tradition is so consistent across multiple independent sources. If the story were purely philosophical, we would expect more variation in how different cultures adapted it. But the core elements, linguistic unity, construction, divine intervention, fragmentation, remain stable from Sumerian texts through Genesis. This consistency suggests the tradition is anchored in something more than abstract wisdom. It suggests a shared memory. Interpretation. 3. Historical memory. Interpreted theologically. In this view, the confusion of tongues preserves a memory of actual historical events, political collapse, the abandonment of monumental construction projects, and the fragmentation of a previously unified or semi-unified culture. The events are real, but they are interpreted through a theological lens because that is how the ancient authors understood causation. The flood represents a catastrophic disruption, perhaps a massive regional flood, perhaps a series of floods, perhaps the collapse of early urban centers that destroyed continuity and required survivors to rebuild civilization from a diminished base. The confusion of tongues represents the political and linguistic fragmentation that occurred during that rebuilding, making it impossible to restore the full organizational capacity of the antediluvian period. The Tower of Babel is a composite symbol. It represents Etemenanki specifically, but also represents all such monumental projects that required coordinated labor, linguistic unity, and institutional continuity. The incompletion of the tower is not mythological but historical. Many ziggurats were begun and left unfinished due to political instability, economic collapse, or loss of central authority. In this framework, the procedural details are evidence that the storytellers were drawing on actual knowledge of construction practices, political administration, and the challenges of large-scale coordination. The divine causation is the interpretive overlay, but the events underneath, flood, fragmentation, failed projects, are historical. Strengths: this interpretation takes seriously both the procedural details and the consistency of the tradition. It treats the texts as attempts to record history, even if the interpretive framework is theological. It accounts for the specificity of the context. Why construction? Why post-flood? Why the emphasis on capability? By grounding the narrative in actual challenges that post-collapse civilizations face. Weaknesses: it requires us to distinguish between the event, historical, and the interpretation, theological, which may not be a distinction the ancient authors themselves would have made. It is speculative because we do not have independent confirmation of a specific historical moment when linguistic unity was deliberately fragmented. We have evidence of political collapses and linguistic diversification, but not of a single event that matches the narrative exactly. Which interpretation is correct? Perhaps none of them in isolation. Perhaps all three contain partial truths. The texts may function etiologically, explaining linguistic diversity. They may encode wisdom about coordination and fragmentation, and they may preserve distorted memories of historical events. Ancient narratives are layered, they serve multiple functions simultaneously. A story can be mythological in structure, philosophical in message, and historical in origin. What we can say with confidence is this: the confusion of tongues tradition is not arbitrary. It appears consistently across multiple sources in specific contexts, with procedural details that suggest real-world grounding. Whether those details point to actual events or to the cultural knowledge of the storytellers, they indicate that the tradition was taken seriously by the cultures that preserved it. The Sumerians believed they were living in the shadow of a greater age. They looked at the ruins of Eridu and Uruk and believed those cities had been founded by gods or godlike kings. They looked at the incomplete or ruined ziggurats and believed they were attempts to reach heaven that had been stopped by divine intervention. Whether those beliefs were accurate or not, they shaped how Sumerian civilization understood its own limitations. And those beliefs were passed down through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures, eventually reaching the Hebrew scribes who incorporated them into Genesis. The Tower of Babel story, as it appears in Genesis, is the final form of a very old tradition. It has been simplified, monotheized, and adapted to Israelite theology. But the bones of the older Mesopotamian tradition are still visible. The post-flood context, the unified language, the construction project, the divine decision to fragment and scatter. What does this mean for us? It means that for 3,000 years the question, what might humanity achieve if fully unified, has been answered with more than the divine realm allows. Whether the divine realm is understood as literal gods, as ruling powers who speak for the gods, or as the structural limits imposed by history and geography, the answer is the same. Human potential is vast, but it is not unlimited. And the limits are not always natural. Sometimes they are imposed, sometimes deliberately. The tower remains unfinished, not because it could not be finished, but because it was not allowed to be finished. That is the message of Babel. And it echoes still. The silence between the bricks. In a private collection in Norway behind climate-controlled glass, the black stone stele MS 2063 rests in silence, Nebuchadnezzar II carved in profile, staff in hand. Below him, the 7-stepped tower rising toward a temple platform. And at the bottom, the geometric floor plan, precise and measured. The stone is cold, limestone, 47 centimeters tall, over 25 centuries old. If you could touch it, you would feel the carved grooves where the ancient mason's chisel shaped the king's face, the tower's outline, the plan's grid. You would feel the smoothness where countless hands have rested, where dust has settled, where time has polished the surface. But you cannot touch it. It sits behind glass, a relic, a witness. What was Nebuchadnezzar trying to say when he commissioned this stele? He was not inventing Etemenanki. His inscriptions make clear he was restoring it, rebuilding what had fallen into ruin. He was reaching back, attempting to recover what had been lost, to complete what earlier generations had begun. Did he succeed? Partially. Etemenanki stood in Nebuchadnezzar's time. Ancient travellers described it. Greek historians recorded its dimensions. It was a wonder of the ancient world, a tower reaching toward heaven, a monument to human ambition and divine connection. But it did not last. Alexander the Great arrived, found it damaged, ordered it cleared for rebuilding. Alexander died before the work could begin. The tower was never rebuilt. The bricks were carried away, the foundation filled with sand. By the time Coldaway arrived in 1899, only the ghost of it remained, a square platform, eroded and empty, 91 meters on each side. What happened to the tower is what always happens when coordination fails, when institutions collapse, when the knowledge of how to maintain great works is lost. The structure endures for a time, and then it does not. The silence between the bricks is the silence of endings, of projects left incomplete, of knowledge that slips away when no one remains to preserve it. But endings are not the whole story. The tower may be gone, but the memory remains. The Sumerians remembered. The Babylonians remembered. The Hebrews remembered. The tradition was passed down through cuneiform tablets, through oral narratives, through the pages of Genesis. It reached us 3,000 years later because someone thought it mattered enough to record. Why does it matter? Because the Tower of Babel is not a story about one structure in one city at one moment in time. It is a story about what happens when humanity attempts to organize itself fully, to coordinate across regions and languages, to build something that reaches beyond the ordinary limits of human achievement. And the story says, every time we try, we are stopped, not by lack of skill, not by lack of ambition, but by fragmentation, by the breaking of unity, by the confusion of the languages that allow us to work together. Is that fragmentation natural, the inevitable entropy of complex systems? Or is it imposed, a deliberate limit to prevent humanity from achieving something the gods, or those who speak for the gods, deem dangerous? The texts leave that question open. They describe the fragmentation as a divine decision, but they do not explain why the decision was made. They give us Enki's steadfastness, God's observation that nothing will be impossible for unified humanity, but they do not tell us what specifically was so concerning that intervention was required. Perhaps because the answer is obvious. Perhaps because the danger is not in any specific thing humanity might build, but in the fact that a fully unified humanity, speaking one language, able to coordinate perfectly, would be ungovernable, not by the gods and not by any human authority either. Power rests on division. Rulers govern because populations are fragmented, because different regions speak different languages, because coordination is difficult enough that centralized authority becomes necessary. If coordination were easy, if every person could communicate perfectly with every other person, if large-scale projects required no intermediaries, no translators, no administrative hierarchy, then the power of rulers and priests would dissolve. Perhaps that is what the divine realm feared. Not that humans would storm heaven, but that they would no longer need the structures that keep them subordinate. This is speculation, of course. The texts do not say this explicitly, but the logic is present in the narrative structure. The tower is unfinished, not because it could not be built, but because allowing it to be finished would change the balance of power in ways the divine realm could not accept. And so the languages were confused. The people were scattered. The tower stood incomplete, a monument to potential rather than achievement. But here is the final thought, the one to carry into sleep. The tower may be unfinished, but the knowledge of how to build it was not entirely lost. Nebuchadnezzar restored Etemenanki. Later kings attempted their own ziggurats. The tradition of reaching toward heaven, of building structures that connect earth and the divine, continued for millennia. It continues still in different forms. We do not build ziggurats, but we build towers that reach toward the sky, monuments that demonstrate our capability, projects that require coordination across languages and borders. And we encounter again and again the same challenge, the difficulty of maintaining unity, the fragmentation that disrupts large-scale efforts, the silence that falls when coordination fails. The Tower of Babel is not a story about the past. It is a story about every ambitious project that depends on human cooperation. It is a story about what we might achieve if we could work together perfectly, and about the forces, whether divine, political, or structural, that prevent perfect cooperation. The question the story asks is not, what did they build, but what might we build if the barriers were removed? And the answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is more than we are currently allowed to. That is the silence between the bricks, the potential that was never realized, the tower that stands unfinished, not in Babylon, but in every moment when human capability is limited, not by what we can do, but by what we are permitted to do. If this resonates with you, if the question lingers as your eyes grow heavy, then the story has done its work. It has reminded you that the limits you experience may not be natural. They may not be inevitable. They may be imposed. What you do with that knowledge is your decision. The texts do not tell you what to think. They only tell you what happened, or what the ancients believed happened, in a time when all the world spoke one language and attempted to build a tower to heaven. The tower was not finished. But the question remains. And perhaps, in the quiet hours, that is enough. Rest well.